The radio was dead, the batteries were frozen, and the patrol was 20 miles behind enemy lines when Corporal Jack Dempsey did the stupidest, smartest thing of his life. He dipped a paper cup in mud, wrapped it in torn foil from his emergency rations, and told his lieutenant he was going to bend the ionosphere. What happened next should have been impossible, but it began 3 hours earlier in December 1944 during the chaotic opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, when a small American reconnaissance team found themselves trapped on a forested ridge after German forces cut off their escape route, leaving them outnumbered, freezing, low on food, nearly out of ammunition, and worst of all, unable to communicate with friendly forces because their SCR-300 backpack radio was crippled by terrain, cold batteries draining power faster than chemistry should allow, iced-up antennas that couldn't properly radiate signals, atmospheric conditions that killed signal propagation, and the fact that the nearest friendly division headquarters was over 200 miles away, far beyond the radio's normal 30-mile range, even under optimal conditions. Corporal Jack Dempsey, 23 years old, knew field radios better than he knew himself, had grown up tinkering with ham radio equipment in his father's garage in Michigan, had aced every Signal Corps training course by actually understanding the physics rather than just memorizing procedures, and now he stared at the damaged SCR-300 with growing desperation because his technical knowledge was screaming that what they needed was impossible. You couldn't just magically extend radio range, couldn't overcome physics with willpower, couldn't transmit through mountains and atmospheric interference to reach a station 200 miles distant with a backpack radio designed for tactical communications. The environment was actively hostile to radio transmission. December cold that made batteries lose 70% of their capacity, snow that absorbed radio waves like a wet blanket, ice forming on the antenna elements that changed their resonance characteristics, and the metallic forest. All those frozen trees with ice-coated bark, creating a Faraday cage effect that trapped signals and prevented them from reaching the ionosphere where they might skip to distant receivers. The team had discovered something that made their communication failure catastrophically important. A massive German armored column moving through the woods in a flanking maneuver that intelligence had completely missed. Dozens of tanks and infantry carriers positioned to hit the American lines from an unexpected direction, a force that could collapse the entire sector and turn what was already a desperate situation into a complete rout. They had to warn headquarters, had to get this intelligence to someone who could redirect forces or call in airstrikes, but every attempt to raise anyone on the radio produced nothing but crackling static, the carrier wave barely making it a mile before dissipating into electromagnetic noise, and with each failed transmission the situation became more desperate because the Germans were moving and every minute meant American soldiers who would die when this armored column hit unprepared. Positions. The team huddled in a shallow depression behind a fallen tree, their situation deteriorating by the minute as a German sniper somewhere in the darkness picked off anyone who moved carelessly. As their medic worked frantically on a scout who'd taken a bullet through the shoulder and was bleeding into the snow, as the temperature dropped below zero and frostbite became as dangerous as German bullets, and as the enemy forces got closer, they could hear diesel engines now, could hear German voices, calling to each other as they swept through the forest. The lieutenant, a green officer who'd been in combat for exactly 8 days, gave the ultimatum that everyone knew was coming. If we can't warn them in 30 minutes, we destroy the radio and attempt breakout, which was a polite way of saying they'd smash the equipment so the Germans couldn't capture it, and then try to infiltrate through enemy lines in what would probably be a suicidal attempt to reach friendly forces on foot. Dempsey stared at the radio, at this 35-pound collection of vacuum tubes and wire and battery packs that represented their only hope of completing the mission without getting everyone killed, and his mind raced through everything he knew about radio physics, about signal propagation, about the weird tricks that sometimes let signals travel impossible distances. He remembered obscure training lectures about improvised HF tuning, about ground plane amplification where conductive surfaces could enhance antenna performance, about dielectric mud effects that nobody really understood but that ham radio operators swore by, about reflective impedance tricks that could focus radio energy in specific directions, and suddenly he saw the absurd combination of junk and physics that might, just might, let them punch a signal through 200 miles of hostile atmosphere. "Sir," Dempsey said, his voice shaking partly from cold and partly from the knowledge that he was about to propose something that sounded completely insane. "I think I can build a directional amplifier, but I need a paper cup." The team stared at him like he'd lost his mind, and the lieutenant actually laughed. A bitter, exhausted sound, because here they were about to die and their radio operator wanted arts and craft supplies, But Dempsey was already moving, already pulling things from his pack and from the gear scattered around their position. A wax-coated paper cup that had held powdered coffee that morning, dirt and snow that he mixed with his bare hands until it became thick mud with the consistency of wet cement. Strips of aluminum foil torn from K-ration packaging with fingers so numb he could barely feel them. A broken tent stake that he snapped into smaller pieces. Copper wire stripped from a spare detonator. And a small candle stub that someone had been saving. His hands shook as he worked. Partly from the cold that made fine motor control nearly impossible. Partly from fear because German voices were getting closer and bullets occasionally cracked overhead. Partly from the sheer desperation of trying to build something that existed more in theory than reality. And he shaped the mud around the paper cup to create a crude parabolic reflector, pressed the foil strips into the mud in a pattern that should create a resonant cavity, though the dimensions were all wrong and he was guessing based on equations he half-remembered from training, used the tent stake pieces to build a framework that could hold everything at the right angle, wrapped copper wire around the cup's rim to create what might function as a parasitic element or might do absolutely nothing, positioned it all so the open end of the cup pointed toward a gap in the trees where he'd have the best chance of shooting a signal toward the ionosphere. The construction was ridiculous. Mud steaming in the cold air, foil catching what little light came from the carefully shielded candle, the whole assembly looking like something a child would make in school. But Dempsey knew the theory was sound even if the execution was desperate improvisation. The cup created a cavity that should resonate at the radio's frequency. The mud's water content made it electrically conductive and would act as a ground plane. The foil functioned as a crude reflecting dish that focused radio energy in one direction instead of letting it radiate omnidirectionally. And if he could get the geometry even approximately right, if the mud's dielectric properties weren't too far off, if the resonance was close enough to the transmission frequency, then maybe, just maybe, he could focus enough of the radio's limited power in a tight beam toward the night sky where it might bounce off the ionosphere and skip the impossible distance to reach someone who could help. But the radio itself was nearly dead, its batteries drained to the point where they barely produced enough voltage to power the vacuum tubes. So Dempsey unbuttoned his coat and shoved the battery pack against his chest, using his body heat to warm the chemical cells because battery capacity increased with temperature and he needed every milliamp he could squeeze from them. He opened the radio's case with numb fingers and found the broken coil connection he'd been suspecting, heated his combat knife over the candle flame until the blade glowed faintly, and used it to resolder the connection with a drop of solder from his repair kit, the smell of burning flux mixing with pine scent and gunpowder and fierce sweat. He tuned the improvised cup assembly by holding the radio's whip antenna near it and listening to the microchanges in static through the headphones, looking for that sweet spot where the resonance was right, where the assembly was actually doing something useful instead of just being mud and foil that accomplished nothing. And he found it, found a frequency where the background noise changed character slightly, became a fraction clearer, suggesting that maybe the cup contraption was actually working as a directional element. German jamming filled most of the frequency bands with buzzing interference, but Dempsey listened carefully and timed his transmission attempts with the brief moments when the jamming stuttered or weakened, when there might be a narrow window to push a signal through. He aligned the cup antenna with the night sky, angling it toward the north where atmospheric conditions might be better for signal skip, where the ionosphere's charged layers might reflect his transmission back to Earth hundreds of miles away, and he calculated in his head, knowing it was mostly guessing, the elevation angle that would give him the best chance of bouncing a signal off the ionosphere's E-layer instead of having it pass through into space or reflect back to Earth too close to be useful. The entire setup was a desperate combination of barely understood physics, improvised equipment, and pure hope, but it was all they had, and the Germans were within 100 meters now. One of the scouts whispered urgently, "Jack, they're right on top of us." And Dempsey knew this was the only shot they'd get because in minutes they'd either be in combat or running for their lives. Dempsey pressed the transmit button, feeling the radio's components warm slightly as power flowed, as vacuum tubes glowed in the darkness, as electrons pushed through circuits and into the antenna where they should radiate as electromagnetic waves that would propagate through space at the speed of light but would probably just die in the frozen forest within a few miles. At first he heard nothing, just the hiss of cosmic background radiation and the crackling of atmospheric noise and the occasional burst of German jamming, and for 5 seconds he thought the entire crazy plan had failed, that he'd wasted their last minutes building a useless mud cup while they should have been preparing to fight or flee. Then, impossibly faint, buried under layers of static and interference, he heard something that might have been a human voice, might have been just his imagination creating patterns in random noise, but he adjusted the antenna angle slightly and heard it again, stronger this time. An American call sign, Victor 72, barely audible through the interference. Then a full voice emerged from the static like a ghost, becoming solid. Recon Team Lima 4. We read you. Signal weak but readable. Say again your traffic. Over. Dempsey's hands trembled as he keyed the microphone, his voice shaking with cold and disbelief and desperate urgency. Victor 72. Lima 4 actual, priority tactical traffic, German armor concentration, my position. And he rattled off coordinates from memory, described the force size and direction, compressed everything they'd observed into 30 seconds of transmission because he knew the signal was fragile, knew the batteries were dying, knew the Germans could triangulate his position if he stayed on air too long. The signal oscillated, fading in and out as atmospheric conditions changed, as the batteries weakened further, as interference swept across the frequency. But Dempsey repeated the critical information 3 times, variation of redundancy that might let the receiving station piece together a complete picture even if they only caught fragments of each transmission, and he channeled every bit of power the SCR 300 could generate without frying its components, pushed it to the absolute edge of its operational limits because after this it wouldn't matter if the radio was damaged. Just as he transmitted the last coordinate, a German soldier spotted the candle glow, that tiny light they'd needed to heat the soldering knife, and opened fire, bullets tearing through frozen branches and smacking into trees around their position, forcing everyone to duck, to abandon anything that wasn't immediately necessary for survival. And Dempsey barely managed to shut down the radio and drag it behind cover before rounds started hitting where he'd been kneeling. The firefight was brief and desperate, the Americans returning fire with what ammunition they had left, the muzzle flashes attracting more Germans, and for 5 minutes it seemed like this frozen ridge would be where they'd all die, where the intelligence they gathered would die with them even though they'd managed to transmit it. Then they heard something that made everyone stop shooting, made even the Germans pause in confusion. A deep rumble from the west, growing louder, the distinctive sound of aircraft engines cutting through the winter silence. 3 P-47 Thunderbolts emerged from the snow clouds like avenging angels, their radial engines roaring, and they didn't drop bombs or strafe randomly. They went straight for the German armored column with the precision of pilots who knew exactly where their targets were, who'd received coordinates and tactical information that let them hit with maximum effectiveness. The artillery started 30 seconds later, American 155mm guns miles away dropping high explosive shells into the forest in a pattern that bracketed the German force. And the team could hear the enemy formation breaking apart in chaos, could hear the screaming of wounded men and the explosions of ammunition cooking off in burning vehicles and the desperate shouting of officers who just watched their entire tactical advantage disappear. The after-action report, filed weeks later when the team finally made it back to American lines, listed the radio transmission as highly improbable contact achieved under adverse conditions through non-standard equipment modification, which was military bureaucracy's way of saying they didn't quite believe what happened but couldn't deny the results. The historians who studied the Battle of the Bulge would note that a German flanking maneuver in the northern sector was disrupted by timely intelligence from forward reconnaissance elements, never mentioning the mud-covered paper cup or the foil from K-rations or the radio operator who'd bent physics just far enough to save lives. Dempsey's improvised paper cup antenna became a legend among field radio operators, a story told in Signal Corps training, embellished with each retelling until some versions had him transmitting to the Pentagon itself, though the truth was impressive enough without exaggeration. Radio engineers who heard the story later tried to calculate whether what Dempsey described was actually possible, whether a crude parabolic reflector made from mud and foil could really have focused enough energy to achieve a 200-mile contact with a tactical backpack radio, and their conclusions ranged from theoretically possible under perfect conditions to absolutely impossible, must have been luck or atmospheric anomaly, but everyone agreed that whatever combination of physics, desperation, and chance had made that transmission work, it proved that sometimes the dumbest idea in a frozen forest, a paper cup dipped in mud and wrapped in foil, can change the outcome of a battle, can save thousands of lives, can be the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat. Dempsey himself never quite understood why the cup antenna worked as well as it did, suspected that multiple factors had aligned perfectly, the mud's conductivity, the foil's reflective properties, the resonant cavity dimensions being accidentally correct, atmospheric conditions creating an unusually good ionospheric skip path, the timing of his transmission coinciding with a lull in German jamming, pure desperate luck. But he kept that paper cup, dried mud and crumpled foil and all, carried it through the rest of the war as a reminder that sometimes survival depends on being willing to try something that sounds completely insane, on understanding just enough physics to be dangerous, on having the creativity to see radio components in coffee cups and candy wrappers, and on refusing to accept that impossible means you shouldn't try.